안녕하세요. 살빼고입니다. 이번에 닥터3 채널에서 진짜 엄청난 연구를 소개를 했는데요. 그동안 찜찜함이 싹 해소되는 연구였습니다. 사실 저는 생리학적으로 당연하다고 생각했었는데 그걸 실제 연구를 통해 증명이 되니 이제 LDL 콜레스테롤은 더 이상 깔 게 없는 물질이 되었습니다. 사실 LDL을 나쁜 LDL, 좋은 LDL 어쩌고 저쩌고 말들이 많았는데 콜레스테롤은 그냥 콜레스테롤일 뿐 나쁘고 좋은 게 없습니다. 그럼 연구 발표 영상 잠깐 같이 보고 오실까요?
So we undertook this study to look at this interesting population of patients who go on a carbohydrated restricted ketogenic diet and end up with a very high LDL cholesterol. And it's not typical. There's many patients with obesity or diabetes who have restrict their carbohydrates. They go on a ketogenic diet, and their LDL gets better, their HDL and triglycerides get better. But there's a subgroup who are very lean, who have a extreme increase in LDL cholesterol. And I'll talk about the mechanism or the proposed mechanism in a moment. But these patients so what we take these patients who are non they have non familial hetero hypercholesterolemia. We had genetic testing to prove that they had a normal LDL at baseline. They went on a ketogenic diet. Their LDL went up to over 200 milligrams per deciliter, and we enrolled them in this prospective study. The prospective study is going to look at a 1 year plaque change with LDLs above 200 milligrams or above 190 milligrams per deciliter on a ketogenic diet to see if they have more rapid plaque progression. What I'm going to show you tonight is the baseline characteristics, their first scan after being on a ketogenic diet for 4.7 years. And we're going to compare it to a population-based study called the Miami Heart Study to look to see if they have increased atherosclerosis compared to matched patients. Now, it should be understood that lean mass hyperresponders are different than FH. While they both have very high LDL cholesterol, lean mass hyperresponders have a normal cholesterol if they have a normal diet. And when they're on a low carb diet, their LDL goes up dramatically. They are otherwise healthy individuals. These are lean individuals in general that we studied, and they tend to have this remarkable response of LDLs that go up. I think worldwide there's somebody with an LDL above 1,000 milligrams per deciliter induced by a ketogenic diet. FH, on the other hand, is a congenital disorder. They have high LDL through their entire life, and it's unrelated to their diet. So we matched 80 of our 100 participants with an LDL above 190 milligrams per deciliter. They had to have high HDL and low triglycerides, matched 1-to-1 for age, gender, race, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, hypertension, and smoking to asymptomatic subjects from the Miami Heart cohort. We couldn't match all 100 patients in our study because Miami Heart didn't have the same age range as we did, but we matched 80 patients to this Miami Heart cohort across all of these different values. We couldn't match them for LDL because, of course, these lean mass hyperresponders had remarkably high LDL. These patients had documented ketogenesis. They had ketones measured, and they had to have, again, normal or no genetic predisposition or no genetic markers of familial hyperlipidemia. These are the baseline characteristics, and there were differences, most notably, of course, in LDL cholesterol. 272 average LDL in the keto group. Miami Heart group had an LDL of 123. All the other variables were well matched. As best we could match these two different populations. So when we looked at this population, they were both 55 years old. Again, the lean mass hyperresponders had an LDL of 272 milligrams per deciliter on an average of 4.7 years duration. So it wasn't like this was 1 week of having LDL this high. This was almost a 5-year duration of having a ketogenic diet and an LDL above 190 milligrams per deciliter. When we compared them to patients with more normal LDLs, mean LDL of 123, there was no difference in coronary plaque burden. So we did not see any evidence that this LDL of 272 induced more atherosclerosis over this 5-year period. We looked at calcium score, we looked at total plaque score on the CT angiogram, and neither of them showed any differences whatsoever. There was no relationship between LDL cholesterol and elevations in presence of plaque. When we look at the calcium scores between the groups, again, 80 patients in each cohort, there was no difference in calcium scores. There's no difference in total stenosis score. In other words, how many stenotic vessels they had. There was no difference in total plaque score and no difference in the number of segments of plaque that were involved with their arteries. So they had exactly the same plaque characteristics as a population of patients who did not have an LDL above 190 milligrams per deciliter. When we look across the different cohorts, you can see LDL up and down and the plaque distribution in green. There was no difference between these two groups. As a matter of fact, the area under the curve was identical. So there was absolutely no increase in plaque between the lean mass hyperresponders with an LDL cholesterol of 272 milligrams per deciliter and the Miami Heart population, which had an LDL cholesterol of 123 milligrams per deciliter, again, matched across all other variables that we could match. When we looked at the total plaque score, how much plaque they had in their coronaries compared to their LDL. This is now stratified across LDL, and we can see total plaque score, no difference across LDLs going up as high as 600 milligrams per deciliter, and no relationship in either the keto group on the left or the Miami Heart group on the right. So these two groups had very, very similar plaque distributions, and there was no significant difference between the two. So what's the proposed mechanism? Well, we know that in lean, metabolically healthy subjects, carbohydrate restriction will lead to glycogen depletion in the liver. And we think that that leads to a lipoprotein lipase mediated turnover, which increases LDL. And you can see at the very bottom here that more LDL mediated VLDL turnover leads to a higher export of VLDL. When you have more VLDL and lipoprotein lipase, you end up with more HDL and more LDL and less triglycerides. You process that VLDL, you convert it into VLDL, you convert it to LDL cholesterol, and you end up with higher levels of both HDL and LDL cholesterol. So we think that it's all lipoprotein lipase mediated. Obviously, this needs more evaluation, but in a lean person, the body switches its energy model to a more activate lipoprotein lipase. When we looked at a cohort of patients, so you could say, well, this is not really a fair analysis. We're looking at 5 years of high LDL versus a lifetime of high LDL. But I want to show you this population of patients from Denmark. In Denmark, they studied patients with coronary calcium scores. These were 11,800 patients with LDLs above 190, very similar to what I just presented. And you'll see that more than 50% of these patients with a lifetime LDL above 190 did not have any coronary calcium. So not all LDL automatically promotes atherosclerosis. And if they have no coronary calcium, their hazard ratio for having a high LDL was 1. There was no increased risk of having a high LDL in the setting of no atherosclerosis. So I don't believe that all atherosclerotic plaque is, that all LDL is necessarily pathological. So our limitations, we only had 4.7-year follow-up. The sample size was only 100 patients. We're going to study these patients at 1 year. follow-up for CT angio, and then hopefully longer term as well. And of course, we did not have hard CV outcomes. But I'll just conclude by saying that these patients with metabolically healthy cohort of lean mass hyperresponders did not have greater atherosclerotic burden than participants matched with more normal LDL values. And there was no correlation in this study between LDL cholesterol and plaque burden. So with that, I'll stop and thank you all very much.
이 연구를 간단하게 설명드리자면 카니버나 키토제닉을 하는데 오히려 LDL 콜레스테롤이 증가하는 사람들이 있었습니다. 그래서 채식주의자들이 저탄수 식단을 공격할 때 낮아지지 않는 LDL 콜레스테롤로 공격을 합니다. 사실 이 부분을 생리학적으로 설명하자면 저탄수 식단을 하는 사람들은 지방을 주요 에너지원으로 사용하기 때문에 체내 지방을 열심히 끌어다 쓰는데, 특히 저탄수 식이를 하면서 마른 체형인 사람들은 사용할 체지방이 충분하지 않기 때문에 대사를 원활하게 하기 위해서 간에서 VLDL을 많이 만들어내 지방을 대사에 사용하게 됩니다. 그래서 지방 대사 후 VLDL의 부산물인 LDL이 많아질 수밖에 없는 것이죠. 그래서 채식주의자들이 거 봐라, 나쁜 LDL 수치가 오히려 늘어났으니 하면 안 되는 식단이라고 공격을 하면, 이런 생리학적인 기전을 모르시는 분들은 식단에 대한 신뢰가 흔들릴 수밖에 없는 것이죠. 그런데 이번 연구는 이런 저탄수식이를 하면서 LDL 콜레스테롤 수치가 높은 사람들과 일반적으로 건강한 사람들의 혈관 상태를 조사했는데 두 대조군의 차이점 없이 모두 건강했다라는 것입니다. LDL 콜레스테롤이 나쁜 콜레스테롤이었으면 저탄소 식이군의 혈관에는 콜레스테롤이 혈관에 쌓여 혈관 상태가 엉망진창이어야 되는데 아주 건강했다는 겁니다. 뭐 당연한 결과인데 이렇게 연구를 통해 증명이 되니 그동안 찜찜했던 점이 확 풀어진 것이죠. 우리 채널 구독자님들은 아시겠지만 콜레스테롤은 관상동맥 질환에 아무런 상관관계가 없습니다. 콜레스테롤은 혈관 상처를 치료해주는 치료제일 뿐입니다. 지방 대사와 콜레스테롤에 대해 조금만 공부해 보시면 주류 의학 영양학계의 콜레스테롤 공포 조장이 얼마나 말이 안 되는 것인지 알 수 있습니다. 그런데 정말 유튜브에서 지방과 콜레스테롤에 대해 제대로 알려주는 사람이 거의 없어요. 그래서 저는 정말 유치원생도 알아듣기 쉽게 설명해 드릴 테니 한번 기대해 보셔도 좋을 것 같습니다. 그리고 앞으로 업데이트 될 내용들이 많으니 구독, 좋아요, 알람 설정 해주시고 기다려 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 그럼 저는 다음에 더 유익한 영상으로 찾아뵙도록 하겠습니다. 그럼 안녕.